Dave Reuben, thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire. We're in
My
the
pleasure.
atrium. The Alliance for Responsible Citizenship inaugural conference has, well, it's not begun now, it's in day 3. You've crossed the pond and given 3 days of your time. I've no doubt that there are people screaming to get your attention from every single direction. Why was this so important that you would spend so much time here?
Well, Jordan. I mean, it is the force that is Jordan Peterson that could create this, that could get people from quite literally every corner of the globe to show up, over 1,000 people, for a 4-day conference to talk about not only ideas, which Jordan is, basically the best at talking about ideas, but talking about solutions. I mean, especially in the context of what's happened over the last 3 weeks, what started in Israel on October 7th and how that has now really proliferated throughout the West, and these protests and confusion over who's the good guy and bad guy when it comes to beheading children and all these things. We are seeing the basic fundamental ideas of the West being eroded at a rapidly escalating pace. And because they've been being eroded for quite some time, and we all know that. And that's why so many of us at this point have careers, because we've been talking about what's going on. But something has really burst forth in the last 3 weeks. Jordan obviously planned this conference well before these last 3 weeks, but it's a fitting time that we're doing it now. I would say every single person in this room is focused on what they're saying in the ARC documents. What is the better story? How did we forget our story? How do we in the West, how do you guys in Australia, a few days after October 7th, have several hundred people chanting "Gas the Jews" at the Sydney Opera House. The Sydney Opera House, where I performed with Jordan in 2018, it was truly one of the top 10 days of my life. It was such a wonderful, wonderful day there. And how does that happen? How do these insane protests that we're seeing here in London, that I drove by last night on the way to dinner, to think that if I got out of my car, it might not end well? And I'm not a British citizen, but there are British citizens that if they walked into it, it might not end well. And that leads us to a place where if we don't start telling a better story, so that Australia can tell the Australian story, so that Australians can live free, and so that Americans can tell that story so we can live free. And then we as Americans and you as Australians and Brits can all come together and say, hey, our stories are a little different, our foods are a little different, our accents are a little different, but the basic ideas of the West, the autonomy and importance of the individual rights, pride in work and family, and all of these things, if we can't do that, what we have seen for the last 3 weeks, that will be what basically takes over for generations. And I don't intend on letting it happen.
No, you and me both. One of the criticisms aimed at the ARC conference is that it's an elite talk fest. It's a bunch of people who are either wealthy or have on the levers of power or enormous amounts of influence. And a lot of people would throw you into the same category. They'd call you one of the elites now because of the influence that you have.
Wow, if I became an elite, who would have known? I was a little YouTuber. Okay.
So how do you respond to the criticism of, well, what relevance does this have? How will this actually change anything?
Well, because if you want to change things, first off, I don't fully agree with the notion, the premise. But that is to say, these are influential people for a reason. These are heads of state or former heads of state. By the way, the Aussie invasion here
isn't it
is
remarkable?
Really something else. Basically, everyone here is Australian, which is wonderful. It shows that because you guys went through a particularly bizarre draconian lockdown situation in your country, which is a country based on individual rights, and where people, from an American perspective, when we think of Australians, we think of Crocodile Dundee, we think of these just like freewheeling, fun, politically incorrect people. So when we saw what was happening with you guys, it was particularly shocking. It was one thing to see it with Canadians, right?
Sure.
Canadians are quiet and nice and whatever. But when we saw it with you guys, anyway, that's a sidebar. What I would say to the question specifically is that you need to move societies in the right way. And what I would say is the right way is towards freedom, not towards engineering people to live as I wish. I mean engineering societies to work in a way that allows people to live as they wish. Well, then you need some intellectuals to explain it.
Sure.
You need some politicians to implement policy that's going to make some sense. You need some media guys to be able to convey those messages, as you're doing right now. And that confluence of people has to sometimes come together and eat a steak and figure it out. That's kind of just how it is. But if this is what people mean by elites, then the elites are really trying to do something good. When people talk about elites, what I think they mean are it's more of the World Economic Forum types,
Sure.
the Klaus Schwab types, the BlackRock types, who are trying to engineer society this way, down this way.
Sure.
Everything that this conference is about is saying you have value as an individual. That's the bedrock. Let's build systems that'll work for you. So really it's a bottom-down approach as opposed to a top-down approach.
If I may be self-indulgent for a moment, I was on the front lines of the pushback against the lockdowns in Melbourne. I have the criminal charges to prove it. Not that I was ever violent. I'm not accused of any violence, but I'm accused of encouraging people to protest and made a documentary about it. I'll send that to your assistant later on, and that might be another story for another time. What went wrong with our story? We're talking about a better story here. Why did we get to the point that things like that could happen in Australia, in Canada, etc.? How did we get here?
Well, I think a lot of people have been trying to answer this question, because if we can't answer that question, to write the news story is almost impossible, right? Because if you think of our story, you can think about it as the Star Wars trilogy. You can't really write Empire Strikes Back without knowing what happened in Star Wars. What went wrong or what went right in one movie to get you to the next one. I would say some of what's happened is that all of us, you guys as Australians, us as Americans, the Brits, we're all suffering from a function of our success. The default position of humanity is not peaceful, it's not integrated, it's not liberal in the true sense of liberalism. And we've had a couple hundred years of it.
Yeah.
And we seem to, and I say this as someone that wrote a book defending classical liberalism, I now tell everybody in America, if you believe in liberalism, true liberalism, the idea of the individual and laissez-faire economics and limited government, so that you can live how you want to live and marry who you want to marry and all of that stuff, have a family the way you want to have a family. In some ways, you have to be more conservative now, and I think that's a good parable for what's happened to our societies. We had so much goodness, we forgot what made us good. Basically, we said, "Oh, anyone is allowed to come into our countries, regardless of their beliefs," thinking that somehow if everyone came in and just saw goodness, that goodness would win the day. And it's fairly clear, certainly from a Western European perspective right now, that does not work. You guys, I would say, have a lesser problem with it. You also have a beautiful situation to some extent because of your geography and you're surrounded by water. There's things that can be done. America has done a far better job of integration than Western Europe. I would say, ironically, Eastern Europe, having gotten through communism a little more closely time-wise than us, Poland, Hungary, they're doing better right now, and maybe we should take some of those lessons and not be afraid to be called bigots and racists for standing up for freedom. If that's the price you have to pay, I suppose we'll have to pay it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Eastern Europeans. During the protests against lockdowns in Melbourne, there were two groups that were heavily overrepresented, and they were new immigrants from communist countries. Was one group massively overrepresented, and the other one was people of faith. And I want to ask this question now: to what degree can we come back and tell a better story and achieve all of what we're talking about without a return to faith? Can these things be separated?
Not really. Not really. Not. I would say on the margins, yes, but at the core, no.
Okay.
There is a reason that Israel seems to be central to this situation right now. The idea that the Jews have nothing to do with the ancient land of Israel.
Yeah.
Where have you been to Israel?
I've never been.
You've never been.
But I grew up reading the Old Testament in the Old King James version.
These, you read these old books, whether you're Jewish or you're Catholic or whatever denomination of Christianity you are, or even if you're Muslim, it's an extension of these stories, right? There is a reason that the assault on the West is starting in Israel right now. If they can disconnect, if you think the Jews have nothing to do with Israel, Jesus of Nazareth in the West Bank, which it's not really known as the West Bank, it was for thousands of years, it was Judea and Samaria. You're not going to believe where the Jews are from, Judea, right? The story of Hanukkah, whether you're religious or not, every Jew celebrates Hanukkah, the same way every Christian celebrates Christmas. The story of Hanukkah is the Jews defending their land, Judea and Samaria, now known as the West Bank, from the Greeks. So the idea that these people weren't there, I think it's a direct assault on the values that the Bible then brought forth. And as Ben Shapiro, who I think is here somewhere, talks about, and he's written about, we have a set of ideas, a sort of biblical set of ideas that come from Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And then we have a philosophical set of ideas that come from Athens, from Greece.
Yeah.
And between those two places is what has made the West flourish.
Okay.
And if we remove all of those altogether, we will not succeed. So it is not to say that a secular, a largely secular society can't exist, but it almost has to be set up through religious principles. And by the way, that's consistent with how the United States was set up. Most of our founders, they wanted a secular society. The United States is, thankfully, I would say, a secular society. But if it's completely devoid of religion, it's not religion per se. Something connected to an empirical truth. We have God-given rights in the United States.
Yeah.
That's the most beautiful statement there is. The state did not make me free.
Yeah.
The state can come from my rights, but it did not make me free. The state is there to protect my rights. That's very fundamental. Hopefully, right. And they don't do it that well, actually. But so, in a very long-winded way, if right now we don't need a purely secular answer to this problem. We simply, if that was possible, our secular institutions would be standing up against some of this stuff. And the truth is, our secular institutions, universities, from our perspective, the NIH, the CDC, our secular institutions have ushered in the madness.
Yeah.
I don't think you can decouple those things.
Yeah. So the ARC conference is 3 days long. It's almost over. We're in the final day now. Obviously, we're not going to change the world in 3 days, but as time goes by, how would you measure success? What tells us if this is working or making a difference?
Well, look, I don't think politics is the answer purely, right? I don't think it's just about elect this guy and this thing will happen. But because of some of the demographic stuff that we're seeing, because of the assaults on using our values against us. So when you see these protesters calling for from the river to the sea, in essence calling for genocide.
Yes.
Well, in America we have the First Amendment. Obviously you guys have different laws related to free speech, as does most of Western Europe. They're using all of our freedoms against us. And that's not the only issue, of course. But until we basically decide how will we defend ourselves from people who have weaponized our institutions, say the CDC locking people in their homes. They've weaponized free speech to the point that they can get right to the edge of telling you that they're going to behead you, and we're still debating whether we should allow that or not. They've weaponized the ability to say, oh, we're a pluralistic society, we like all people, and then we're going to allow people in who don't like us, the paradox of tolerance. We need some politicians that will do the right thing. But again, I don't think it starts with politicians. It starts with a conference like this to hopefully empower people to have the right ideas, to figure out what that great story is or what the next chapter in that story is. Freedom is worth fighting for. The American dream that became the dream of the world. The idea, as my great-grandparents did and as almost everyone in America's ancestors did, they came from nothing. No one came to America with a ton of money. There was an oil tycoon or two. Not even. I mean, they made their money with oil in America, but there might have been, a couple people on the Titanic that somehow made it over after that had, aristocrat money from here, from Europe, that made it over. But the dream of America was the dream you have nothing, basically. Sure. The one suitcase, the jacket, and then your children will have it better. Their children will have it better. And that has worked. That is a story. And maybe we have to color in that story a little bit better. But I think eventually that leads to we need massive policy changes. And we have to realize that just because, and I say this from an American perspective, just because we have great foundational documents, I would say the best man-made political documents ever, they're only worth the paper that they're printed on if we don't put them into action, and that's the great challenge.
Dave Reuben from the Rubin Report. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for talking to us.